using way too many napkins.
There we go. Just had to get to that. All right, so we're starting chapter 6. Like I said, we're finishing off unit 1, which is on philosophical tools, right? And then the goal is to apply these philosophical tools in the second half of the course. So I asked you for today to think about something that could be our anchor, some sort of canon that we could use to anchor our discourse, in addition to Plato and the Katha Upanishad, which I chose. Did you come up with anything? A B movie?
You've seen the B movie, right? Oh my god. You haven't seen the B movie?
The animated movie?
Yeah.
The bee,
You know
about a
who Jerry
bee?
Seinfeld is?
Yeah, yeah.
This is the B movie. You have to watch the B movie.
I have seen the bee movie. I just don't have it's not as firm in my memory as it is in yours.
I mean, you were like confused when I said it at first.
Well, I thought because there's also a B movie, like a bee, that's also a thing. But it's a play on words, right? The B movie.
Well, yeah. I don't know what the other thing is.
It's like a low budget porno. like Skinamax.
That's not what I was
It's like Skinamax. You know Skinamax? Is that a term anybody uses? No? Okay. All right. B movie? Is that what you want to watch? Logic. So I don't talk too much about this kid, Aristotle. Quick story. So when I was at Harvard, I led this teaching conference, and was at one of the sessions, and just like hanging out beforehand and chatting with one of the other doctoral students. It was all for doctoral students, teaching them how to teach and that kind of stuff. And this guy, I never really interacted much with the philosophy department. I was in the theology department, and this guy he's like, I'm doing my doctorate in philosophy. And I was like, oh, cool. What are you doing your philosophy on? Dissertation on. And he said, peripatetic philosophy. I said, oh, wow, that's crazy. So you don't drive? And he was like, what? I was like, peripatetic philosophy. And he said, yeah, like Aristotle. And I was like, yeah, but peripatetic means pathetic meaning walking, and peri meaning everywhere, right? So peripatetic philosophy is walking everywhere. So it was a super funny joke, and the guy who's doing his dissertation on it didn't get it. It's like, damn it. If the one time that dad joke would work, and it failed. Anyway, I thought it was pretty funny. Yeah, it was, right? So Aristotle, this kid who came after Plato.
Aristotle was Plato's student.
There's a funny line from one of my favorite lines from The Good Place, which none of you've seen, but yeah, Kristen Bell, her character, says,
It's like,
who died and made
left
Aristotle
in charge of ethics?
Plato.
Like, literally, Plato died and left Aristotle in charge of ethics. Like, that's literally what happened. Anyway, we're not talking about ethics, but we're talking about logic. So Aristotle wrote the book on logic, more than one book on logic, and a really good philosopher in logic. Not a huge fan of his in a lot of other places, but definitely in terms of logic. And the first rule of logic, part of why I didn't have any notes for this today, so I've taught this many times before, taught it in the spring, then got to the final exam and asked, 60-70% of my students, what's the first rule of logic? And 4 of them got it, which was super frustrating, because it's like, I'm trying to make this the main point, right? First rule of logic. First rule of logic. So I'm going to ask it on the exam this year, and I'm expecting more people to get it right. First rule of logic is to clearly define your terms. That's not exactly how Aristotle said it. That's what I want you to answer, though. Aristotle called it, or it's usually referred to as the rule of identity. And it is the second and third rules of logic really don't matter if you follow the first rule of logic. Second and third rules just become like checks. Like if you did the first rule of logic well, then second and third just naturally follow. Second and third, I'll go ahead and mention them now, but we'll come back to them. So the rule of non-contradiction And the third is the rule of excluded middle. But again, they all kind of depend on doing this first one well. So clearly defining your terms. So one of the things we talked about the other day, or one of the things I talked about the other day, right, is that sometimes you get in a conversation with somebody where you're just like talking across each other, right? Like you're saying one thing and they're just hearing something different. And they're responding in a way that's like, you're not listening to me, right? You're not understanding what I'm saying, right? We've all had those kind of very frustrating conversations. And a lot of times it's because we're using words in different ways, right? So we use words and we use the same words that some other person is using, but the way I understand it is different than the way Lonnie understands it, which is different than the way Patrick understands it. And so we're using the same words, but we mean different things by them, right? We should understand already why this happens. Why does this happen? What do we learn in chapter 2 that clearly explains why that happens? 2b. What did we learn in chapter 2? What do you remember from chapter 2? Chapter 2 is on epistemology. What is epistemology? Okay. Got to learn it if you want to pass the class. How do we know what we know? So that's the question, right? And so how do we know what we know? Yep.
Comparative relations.
Comparative relations is what I'm looking for, right? So we have some experience with some archetype, right? You're going to definitely write it down this time and remember it, okay? Do you have a pencil?
Yep.
Coming to class and not learning will not get you a passing grade in my class, okay? It will get you another seat in my class next semester. So archetype, right? So we have some experience with this thing, and then we ask mommy and daddy, what the hell is that? And they give us a word, right? And they say that thing is a dog or a cat or whatever it is, right? And we learn that thing. And that's our first experience, our first type of, the first type that we've encountered. And then we have other experiences with this thing, right? Or similar, right? Things that are similar but different, right? And so whatever our first experience with that thing is obviously Connor's experience with that thing is going to be different than Patrick's, is going to be different than Ryan's, is going to be different than mine, right? Because we're all different people and we have different experiences with different mommies and different daddies and different backgrounds, right? So the way that we understand this word is going to have a lot to do with those series of experiences that we've had previously, right? And so when Connor uses a word, right, he's going to use it in a way that like is consistent with the way he's experienced that thing, right? And then when Zach hears what he said, Zach's going to hear it and he's going, well, I know that word too, right? But he has a different series or history of experiences with that thing, so he's going to understand that word differently, right? This is just the way things work, right? But it's not logical, right? If we want to communicate logically, then we need to make sure that we all understand the words the same way, right? That doesn't mean that through logic, Zach's experiences are suddenly going to be the same as Abby's. They're not, right? But for the sake of the conversation, for the sake of the logical discourse, right? If we're having logical discourse, what's the definition of philosophy? I said the thesis statement for the whole semester. Yeah, Austin. Okay, yeah, this you can 100% count on this in the exam for everybody. I want everybody to have it memorized. So philosophy is a mode of discourse for the sake of training the intellect which is that decision making, right? By what?
Cultivating a desire for wisdom and truth.
Yeah, truth, wisdom, justice, all of those. Through inspiration. Right? So So yeah, this is first half of the course, Unit 1, right? Teaching you how to have modes of discourse, like phenomenological discourse, right? How to have modes of discourse, which you practice in your podcasts discussions. And training the intellect through sharpening our words and that sort of stuff, what we're doing now. Then when we move into the next units, we'll talk about cultivating a desire, right? We talk a lot about erotic desire in Unit 2 and Unit 3. Podcast 4, I guess. And inspiration in chapters 10, I guess. Okay, so training the intellect. So how does philosophy train the intellect, right? Intellect is that which makes the part of your mind that makes decisions, right? And so one of the ways you train the intellect, training, we can think about training in a couple different ways. Socrates used lots of sports metaphors, right? And training, like the allegory of the chariot that we talked about before, right? That sort of wrestling with the horse of logic and the horse of desire, right? And so that the intellect has got to strengthen itself so it can control these two forces, right? One of the ways is by strengthening the horse of desire, or training it to desire these things, right? Another way is by sharpening the horse of logic, strengthening the horse of logic, right? So you've got those two horses, right? The intellect is the charioteer. Then the horse of logic and the horse of desire. And Socrates, makes clear this horse is super strong, this horse is super obedient, right? So this horse always does what you say, but it's not very strong unless you strengthen it. And you strengthen it by following the rules of logic. And the main rule of logic, first rule of logic is what? I literally underlined it and it's on the board. Can you read what's on there?
Clearly define your terms.
Awesome. First rule of logic is to clearly define your terms, right? If you don't clearly define your terms, then people around you aren't going to know what you're talking about, right? If you're going to go into what's your major? Business or something? What do you want to go into? Right? In order to design a game, in order to create a game, especially a digital game, right, you need to write code. And code is all rational, which is binary, which is defining your terms, right? If you have a debugging error, right, if you're running through debugging and you get a critical error, it's usually because something is poorly defined, right? You get like a syntax error or something when you're debugging, which is because the terms aren't clearly defined. Logic is programming. Programming is logic, right? They're not different things. They're math, they're logic, all those kind of things. Right? So we got to clearly define our terms. I feel like I'm beating this horse, but I'm beating it because prior experience is like people don't take this part seriously. This is everything. This is logic, right? So the next rule of non-contradiction. So rule of identity in logical terms is usually written like this. A equals A. That's literally how logic professors, logicians write the first rule of logic. A equals A. It's dumb, and I don't know, but it's, means that, like, your terms always have to mean the same thing, right? Like, if I were to say, Ryan, I'll sell you an apple for $100. Good deal or bad deal?
Selling that for $100?
Yeah.
Man, probably bad deal.
It's apple season. Too good. No, you don't want to take the deal? Really? Just paid $1,000 for an iPhone 9. Offering it to you for $100. And you're like, no?
I see what you did there.
Did you see what I did there? What did I do there?
A doesn't equal A. There.
Right. Apple doesn't equal apple, right? Apple can mean different things. Apple can mean a fruit. Apple can mean phone. Apple could mean a company, right? A corporation. One of these things is worth about 99 cents, right? One of these things is worth about $1,000. One of these things is worth 4 billion. Neighborhood? No, it's not even close, is it? It's like It's over a trillion. It's over a trillion. It's over a trillion. Yeah, it's over a trillion. The numbers get so right. No, over a trillion.
2.3 trillion.
Huh?
2.3 trillion.
Wow, see? Man, if I offered it for $1 trillion, I would have been. Okay. Right? So let your terms, even Jesus said, let your yea be yea and your nay be nay, right? Say what you mean what you say. Make your terms clear, clearly define them. Don't be confusing, don't be manipulative, don't trick people or deceive people. It is a good, handy way to trick and deceive people, though, yeah.
Can the terms change, like, based on the scenarios?
So you can use, it's fine to use the word apple in all these different ways, in different contexts, right? But we need to be clear, right? So if I want somebody to understand, if I'm trying to deceive someone, this is a handy trick to know, right? If I'm trying to be clear and get somebody to understand what I'm saying, then yeah, I can use the same word in multiple ways, but I need to be clear about how I'm using it, right? Make sense? So how does this help to train the intellect? One of the ways is when we're having discourse with one another, right? Like in your podcast discussions, if Abby says something and Lonnie's like, I don't know what you mean, right? What do you mean? Then usually that's, hey, clarify how you're using this word, right? Some key word in there. Just explain what you mean, right? Doesn't mean that you're using it wrong. You're using it the way you're using it, right? Nothing, no rule saying that we all have to use words exactly the same way. But if we want to communicate what's in our heads, right, to describe the phenomenon, which is always in our heads, right, so that we can get at the thing itself, right? So the goal is always to get at the thing itself, and you have to describe the phenomenon, which is in your mind, right? Right, then you've got to do that using words, rational entities, right? Words, rational entities are words and anything that can be put into words and numbers. And those words and numbers need to be clearly defined. What if I were to say, if I were to try and do math, right? And I was like, 2 plus 3 equals 70. Because in my world, 3 is 67. That would just be dumb, right? Yeah, I could define it that way, but it's not math, right? In math, 2 always needs to be 2. Plus always means the same thing. 3 always means 3, right? Equals always means equals. So above the door of the academy, I don't remember if I said this the other day or not, but above the door of the academy, Plato wrote, over the door of the academy, it said, none shall enter here who do not know mathematics. That may be a little foreshadowing for Wednesday's class. When we go to logic, we'll talk the relationship between logic and mathematics. None shall enter here who do not know mathematics, right? You can't do... Logic is math, math is logic. The only difference between logic and math is that math usually uses numbers and logic usually uses words, but, the same thing. Like 2 is a number, but it's also a word, and it always needs to mean the same thing, right? And if it doesn't, then we're not being logical or mathematical, right? Following? Cool? Following? All right, and then so non-contradiction, usually written like this, A never equals not A. Crazy. And then the excluded middle. Excluded middle is basically saying there's nothing between, if we're clearly defining our terms, right, then something's either going to be A or the opposite of A. What's the opposite of A? Not A, right? The opposite of A is not A. So I was thinking of an example on the drive here. And I always have 2 coffee mugs, one for the drive here and one for class. And I was drinking from my coffee mug, thinking about an example, trying to update my chapter 6. And as I did, I took a sip of coffee, and it was near the bottom of the cup, and I don't know what was in it, but I know that it was not coffee, right? Because it was not liquid, right? So the opposite of liquid is not liquid, right? The opposite of coffee is not coffee. I don't know what it was. I'm pretty sure it was coffee grinds. But I spit it out, so I'm driving down the road, like spitting back into my coffee cup. Fortunately, I had another one. But, right, so the opposite of A is not A. The opposite of red, not red. Good. Because something could be like colorless, right? Or something could be a car, right? A car is, it could be red or not red, right? But it's just different, right? So there's just a whole universe of things that are not this thing. So however we, if we're going to be logical, we have to clearly define the terms that we're using. Now, this may seem at odds with something that I said in chapter 3. Chapter 3 was on phenomenology. Yeah, and so when I gave you the phenomenological method, what are the steps of phenomenological method? Let's run through those real fast. You have those in your notes? What's the first step? Yeah, so step 0 is draw a circle. But literally, you're right. The first step 1, is to vaguely ID the thing itself. Now, let's see if we can figure out how to make sense logically of these two things, right? Here I'm saying the first rule of logic is to clearly define your terms. And here I'm saying the first rule of phenomenology is to vaguely identify the thing, right? Why wouldn't we say clearly define the thing, clearly identify what we're talking about? These two things at odds? They seem at odds with one another? Yeah? Can we make sense of why? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. What are those other steps? Step 2 is, so why do you think the two are at odds? Yeah. So you have to vaguely identify this, right? And then clearly, carefully, logically describe this, right? Why? Because no one has access to this except for you. That's in your head, right? So you want to try and clearly, carefully describe what's in your head as logically and carefully and precisely as possible, right? Because if I want Austin to know what I'm talking about, I've got to get what's in my head over into Austin's head, right? But we all already said we all use words and understand words differently, right? Because of comparative relation and our histories with those words. So when I use words, Austin's going to understand them differently, right? So then, but I don't know what words he's going to understand differently and what words he's going to understand the same, right? So so I kind of describe as carefully as I can, as logically as I can, the phenomenon, whatever's in my head, and then I listen as Austin says, what do you mean by this, right? What does this word mean? How are you using this word, right? What do you mean? That seemed like what you just said seems to contradict my experience, right? So explain what you mean, right? And then that forces me to define my terms more clearly, right? So I'm like, well, this term seems obvious to me that it means this, right? But it's not obvious to Abby because she just said it seems like you're using that word in a different way. So then I have to explain what I mean. It doesn't mean she has to agree with how I'm using the word. It just means she has to understand how I'm describing the phenomenon, right? And then she can describe the phenomenon in her own way or whatever, right? And I'll say, how are you using those words? And through that process, it's sort of like sharpening a tool. You know, if you're sharpening a knife or something like that, then you kind of like, you go like one side and then the other side. Well, that's how you hone a knife, right? Then you're kind of like sharpening one side, sharpening the other side. So you're more carefully defining, right, and refining your terms. The term define, this prefix in English means to make, right? It can also mean other things, but in this case, to make and fine means from the word finite, right, or finished, or even fine, right, refined, fine, like a fine-tooth comb is something really small, right, detailed, fine details, finishing work, that kind of stuff. If you're finishing, I make furniture and, like woodworking and stuff. You want to like refine it and polish it and sand it down, right, make it finished. So to make finite, to make finished, to set the boundaries, right, this is another way of saying it, to make or to set the limits, right? So to define means to make finite, or to set the limits or boundaries, right? And if you've done that well, then you've said, all right, I'm going to clearly define this, and anything that fits this definition is definitely that thing, right? And anything that does not fit that definition is not that thing. Fine, right? So if it's not easy to do, is it? It's not easy to do. But if we've done it well, and it's really hard to do on your own. It's easier to do when you're in dialogue or discourse with other people, because that way they think of things that you don't think of, right? And they're like, well, did you think about it, what about this? This seems like that doesn't fit your definition. And I'll say, you're right. So let's make my definition better, right? By taking this other thing into consideration. Make sense? And then through that process, we're all training our intellects to refine things and define things more clearly, so we can strengthen this horse of logic, so that we can, right, stronger horse of logic can not overcome, but at least have a better chance against that horse of desire, so that when we're training our intellect to make decisions, then we can follow. Make sense? How all these tie together? Cool. So back to the original question. Vaguely, what's the difference? How are these two things, how do we reconcile these two things, right? Why vaguely identify the thing itself? And the reason is because I want to, right, one of the most important things about phenomenology is to distinguish between the thing itself and the phenomenon. The phenomenon's up here, the thing in itself is not. So if I want to know what this thing is, then I can't pretend like my experience, my understanding of the thing is the end-all, be-all of, right? They can't pretend like the phenomenon that's in my head is exactly the same as the thing itself. I can think it is, I can believe it is, it's my experience of what it is, right? But Lonnie is going to have a different experience of the same thing, right? So I want to sort of vaguely identify this thing. Also, this thing, the whole point of the phenomenological method, it's a method, right, of investigation or inquiry, right? The religious or the philosophical quest, or sort of looking into things, questioning, right? Questioning this thing. So what is this thing, right? And so we're trying to get to know the thing itself. We're trying to figure out what it is. And so I already have some idea of what it is, right? That's my phenomenon. I want to carefully, clearly describe that in as logical, precise terms as I can. But I also want to know, what am I missing, right? What other angles haven't I, what experiences has Abby had that I haven't had, right? And so if we're doing something, if we put something in the center like justice, then obviously I have a lot of experiences with justice and injustice, a lot of understanding of what justice and injustice is, but Parker's going to have different experiences, and Lena's going to have different experiences, and Zach's going to have different experiences, right? So then I can't pretend like I'm the only person in the world who knows about justice, or that I know everything about justice, and that I don't have anything to learn about justice from Austin, right? So I want to say, all right, let's talk about justice. We all know the word. Let's not pretend like we know what it is, and say, here's what I think it is, but then I'm eager to hear what you think it is, right? And then through that discourse, then we are able to define it a little bit more and a little bit more, right? But we're never going to be able to clearly define terms like justice, wisdom, and truth, because they're ideas which, by definition, transcend rational logic. Oh yeah, rational. Didn't teach you that word. Rational. We did it earlier, I guess, but right, logic and rationality. So we have in here, right, the word ratio. In Latin, ratio or ratio means exactly what it means in English, which is ratio. We have to have two things and a ratio between two things. But ratio is also the Latin word for mind, right? So our mind, or the rational part of our mind, is binary, right? Which has got to have a ratio between these two things. What two things? A and not A. Zeros and ones, right? This or not this. Red or not red. I don't know if Brahmagupta is just going to confuse you more. Sure, let's do Brahmagupta. See if this hits. Okay, so there's this kid, Brahmagupta. He's a Indian philosopher in India, and southern India, I think like Kerala region. Not sure about that, but in India, somewhere around like I don't know, let's say around 550 CE. I'm not exactly sure, but that's not far off, right? It's that range. I know he was before Shankara, who's another philosopher that I study. So he is credited, I guess, like by historians and scholars and mathematicians and everything. He's generally credited with being the first human, or the oldest known human, to come up with the idea of zero, right? So we've got all these numbers, 1 through 10, but then 0, right, is also in there. So this phrase, so when I learned that years ago, Brahmagupta is a great philosopher, and a mathematician and astronomer, and sort of a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary thinker, and writer. And he wrote this. This comes from a book that he was writing mostly on math. It was like a whole bunch of math equations and math things. And he wrote Shunyam Shunyat Rina Akasha. Shunyam Shunyat Rina Akasha. And usually, especially by people who don't know Sanskrit, this is translated by people who don't know Sanskrit as 0 minus 0 equals 0. And this is touted or said to be like the first time that a human used 0 in this way. What's wrong with that? Even if you don't know any, assuming you don't know any Sanskrit, right? But just looking at it, what's wrong with that translation? Yeah. Oh, so the opposite of 0, right? Yeah. Cool. Okay. Yeah, I think he is trying to say something about the opposite of 0. He definitely is. I'm not sure that I really got that until now, but yeah. So, but let's notice what, like just the words, right? Shunyam, shunyat. The two versions of the same word, right? This just means, this ending means from. So shunyam means emptiness. It's a very important philosophical word. Definitely translated as 0. 0 definitely works as a translation of shunyam. So 0, rina means taken away or minus, right? Taken away, it literally means taken away. So 0 taken away from 0 equals akasha. But if it were 0 minus 0 equals 0, you would expect the same word here, right? You expect it's shunyam again, but that's not what it is, right? It's not shunyam, it's a different word. So even if you don't know any Sanskrit, you can say, all right, well that can't be right? There's something being communicated, otherwise why wouldn't it be the same word again? Shunyam, right? It would be shunyam, shunyat, rina, shunyam, but it's not. It's rina, rinyat. Shunyam, shunyat, rina, akasha. Akasha, another certain super important philosophical word. But the main, most common translation of akasha is just space, right? Just sort of. It's also good translation would be the limitless, right? That which is, unlimited. Or the infinite. Snap. Right? So you could say 0 minus 0, 0 equals, probably the best translation might be just that, right? Just emptiness, just limitlessness, right? We're trying to get, where I'm trying to get is to the paradox of signification. So this is leading towards that. I want to get to that before we stop. There's something about 0 that's unique. First of all, why does 0 have the shape that it does? Right? One in pretty much every numerical system around the world and throughout history, 1 pretty much always looks like that, right? 2 has lots of different shapes and that kind of stuff, but 1 pretty much always looks like that, and 0 always looks like this. We know why 1 always looks like that, right? Because that's how we learn what 1 is, right? 1. Everybody understands that, right? Doesn't matter what language you speak or what culture you're from. If you do this, everybody knows that means 1, right? 1 finger. What about 0? How does it have that shape? Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's a really cool point. Word. I like both of those answers very much. So no angles and infinite. Cool. I think both of those are right. Another right answer is because 0 is drawing a circle around nothing, right? It's sometimes called a placeholder, right? So it's like holding. It's a placeholder, but it's a unique placeholder because it's a placeholder that holds nothing in place. Placeholder that holds nothing in place, right? So what's on the board here? Nothing, right? Nothing is there. Now if I draw a 0, 0 means nothing. If I have $0 in my bank account, right, then I have nothing in my bank account, right? So 0 is nothing. But now, is there nothing written here? Now there's something written here, right? And the something is a signifier, right? So 0, let me give you a definition, right? Let me clearly define my terms and give a definition of 0. 0 is a signifier. Signifier is a word, right? It's a sign. It's something that points to. Signs point, right? If you like the exit sign, that way, right? The bathroom sign, that way. The library sign, that way, right? Signs point. Stop sign says stop here, right? Yield sign means yield here, right? Signs point to something. They signify something. 0 is a signifier, points to something else. It's a signifier that signifies nothing. 0 is a signifier that signifies nothing. Now here, we're coming to this paradox, right? 0 is a signifier that signifies nothing, thereby turning nothing into something. Right? So there was nothing on the board, right? There's nothing on the board here. If I, right here, there's nothing on the board here. But now that nothing that was here before, and which was nothing before, now I've drawn a sign around it, right, to say, look, here is nothing, right? But in doing so, I've turned this nothing into a different nothing than this nothing over here. Follow? It's cool, right? So by differentiating between this nothing and that nothing, I've created something, right? I've caused nothing to be, right? I've given 0 gives nothing a place to be. This might not seem like super important stuff, but I guarantee you, I promise you, that this is like, if we understood all of this stuff, the United States of America would have far fewer problems than it does. If we understood signifiers and how signifiers function, the ontology of signifiers, the paradox of signification, then there'd be a whole lot of bullshit in the world. And it would fix a lot of our problems. So signifiers create something. They turn nothing into something, right? So it gives nothing a place to be, right? So we talk about the ontology of, right, the center of that circle, center of systematic philosophy, right? Chapter 1, ontology, the study of what does it mean to be. And on the outside of that, we've got epistemology and language, right? Language is in here because we know things rationally through words and numbers, right? Words and numbers are language, and how we define things gives them a certain ontology, gives them a being, right? So we talked about Santa Claus, right? Santa Claus is a word which we use in language, which exists as a rational entity, which is therefore different than Rudolph, right? Rudolph is a different word. One, they exist, and I told you the definition of existence, etymology of existence. To exist is comes from existere, to stand out, right? So if it stands out from something, so we could say Santa Claus doesn't exist as a sensual entity. You can't see Santa Claus or hear Santa Claus. You can see somebody dressed up as Santa Claus or pretending to be Santa Claus or a drawing of Santa Claus, right? But those are images and personifications. You can't actually see Santa Claus because he doesn't exist as a sensible entity. But you can tell the difference between Santa Claus and Rudolph, right? Who's also a made-up entity, but they exist. They stand apart from one another, right? Follow? So they've been defined, and that definition, that signification, calls them into existence, right? So they exist at least as rational entities, as signifiers. What Brahmagupta is saying here is that we have to remember that our signifiers signify something, and 0 is a unique signifier because it is a signifier that signifies nothing, thereby turning nothing into a something. So if we want to subtract 0 from 0, we have to remember that the null set is a thing. The signifier is a thing, right? So to subtract nothing from nothing is not 0, right? But instead is to erase the signifier. Follow? May not seem it. I just taught you like decades of 20th century philosophy. Is it cool?
I understand it. It's just
Don't see why it's so important.
yes.
Okay. All right. What if we do not something like nothing, right? The whole point of doing nothing, though, is because it's just kind of like a pure signifier. It's a unique signifier because it signifies nothing and calls that nothing into being. And it's easy to understand how it's taking this nothing here, right? And it's making, I mean, what if I put it here, right? Or here, or there, right? I don't know. Like, where do I put, which nothing do I call into being? Then all of a sudden that looks like 5, right? But what if I were to do something like, I don't know, just make up, what if we do something like gender? Right? And then we say, all right, so gender's a word, right? What does it signify? How do we define gender? It's a signifier. You've heard of it before? Yeah. Okay. So something to do with reproduction. That sounds to me like sex, right? So let's say we've got.
Sorry.
Okay. So gender is a signifier and sex is a signifier, right? Right, these are different signifiers. So what are they signifying? What's the difference? Is there any difference between sex and gender? What's the difference?
Kind of like a social construct.
What do y'all think? Yeah. Psychological? Seem a little bit like, something out there, like the thing itself or something like that, something that exists out there, versus something that exists as a phenomenon in our heads or something, right, like that. A signification that's brought into being by defining a word, turning nothing into something, or turning sex maybe into a different thing, right? But yeah, I like that. Other thoughts? So, biology. What if we think about it in terms of genetics? So how do we define sex in terms of genetics? Yeah. So 23 base pairs of chromosomes, right? And then, so typically you have XX and XY, right? How typically? Are there other possibilities?
The only thing I can think of is like sometimes there's an XXY.
Yeah.
Certain things like just one X. Or like what people like identify as hermaphrodites, where they have like I'm not sure what chromosome that would be. I'm not that smart about it.
Yeah, I'm not either, but yeah, I already wrote XXY. Yeah. So then how many sexes are there? I mean, we've already got 4, seems like, right? And if we define sex in terms of genetics, and we define, so we could say like, I don't know, around 50.5% of humans fall into this category, and about 48.5? Math. 49? No. 48. 0.5% fall into that category, right? And about 1% fall into some other category, right? Not one of these two. I don't think my numbers are super far off, right? So then if we were to define sex in terms of biology in a scientific genetic way, then we would look at large populations and say, all right, so a large, the majority of humans fall under this sexual category, smaller number but close to have fall under that category, and then there's still 1%, so 1% of what, 7 billion is like 700, what is 1% of 7 billion? A lot of people, large number of people. 70 sounds right. 70 million. We'd be subtracting 2 zeros from 7 billion. So subtracting 1 billion would be 700. I think 70 sounds right. 70 million? Okay. A lot of people, right? So around 70 million people in the world, right, don't fall under one of these categories. So then would we still consider them human? We still consider them to have a sex? Right? So then sex then on a biological level is non-binary, right? When we already clearly defining our terms, right? Logically. Does it matter? Does it matter how we define it? No?
I mean, if there's like she said, that
Okay.
it's just for reproduction.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let me ask the question another way. When we, in our world, in the United States of America in 2022, which is a midterm election year, does it matter how particular candidates or people in positions of power define sex and gender?
Kind of seems like it's a political thing these days.
So then, right? So how we define our terms has a direct relationship with ethics and how we understand ourselves and other people around us and how we understand existential purpose and how we make decisions, right? Did I draw a pretty clear line between first rule of logic, clearly define your terms, and why it matters? Okay, cool. Can we think? That's it then. Any questions? Okay, that's it for chapter 6. I got so much more that I didn't cover in chapter 6, but I feel like I nailed that point, so that's important. But this movie or show or thing, right? Can we pick something? Can we pick something on Monday?
Is there a reason why we're doing it? Like,
Yeah.
watch it and like analyze it together?
Well, we want something that can anchor our discourse, right? We need something that can ground our discourse. And we're going to use Plato to ground our discourse. And we're going to use the Katha Upanishad to ground our discourse. But I picked those, right? And so I want y'all to pick something. And I want something that's going to be like part of our social cultural milieu, right? Something from the now, something that is relevant to everybody, that's is significant to everybody, right? That we come up. Yeah.
I think we should do like a vote or something.
We should do a vote, but we need some things to vote on. I mean, we could vote.
I'm thinking first of all we should vote like if we want to do a movie or a TV show, and then we could probably come up with like.
I mean, the advantage of a TV show is, you've got like, we can say, watch this episode for this class, watch that episode for that class. So we can kind of keep going with it for multiple classes and not have a whole lot to watch for each class, right? But we could also pick and choose, right? We could do like one Black Mirror episode because they stand on their own, and we could do like one Rick and Morty episodes because they're episodic, and we could do, we could pick and choose. Yeah.
I was just gonna say we have to make sure that shows like don't need to you don't need to watch season 1 to understand season 5.
Exactly, right? Yeah, we don't want to. Yep, this is an important point.
I have a recommendation.
Yeah.
It's okay with it.
Yeah.
If we're doing like specific episodes, I
Yeah.
have a few good Chrono Lines episodes.
Okay,
if we wanna do
sure.
that, but-
Yeah. Why don't we come to class? I said this on Monday and it didn't happen. But how about on Monday y'all actually come to class with some suggestions? Okay, so you got extra time, right, to do it. One other thing. I'm gonna give you homework. Yeah. Yeah. I want you to listen to. You don't even have to listen to the whole thing. Like if you get bored and you want to turn it off, you can absolutely do that. But I would like you to at least start listening to the podcast that I recorded the other night. Yeah, I don't. It's not even so much about the content as the format and that sort of thing. How we're having phenomenological discussions, right? More like format thing than content. We do talk about phenomenology, neural networks, and that kind of stuff. But I will send the link. I'll send an email to the class with the link to it. Yeah.
Are there specific things for this podcast that you want us to talk about?
So don't do the podcast yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I will answer that next Wednesday. Yep.
So there isn't a podcast due this week?
No, we pushed it back. Yep, pushed the due date back. Yeah. So no podcast due until after I do chapter 7.
Did you post the fixed schedule?
I will.
Okay, cool.
So I will share the podcast and do the updated schedule.
Awesome.
And I'm a little behind on the videos, but I'm almost caught up. So getting those online. Cool. Have a good weekend. Have a long weekend. See you next Wednesday.